This is Gnosis of the Body, where we explore embodied wisdom in healing the mind-body split through personal stories, using Jungian depth psychology, mythology, and following collective trends, and following wisdom stories of the body. Welcome back to Gnosis of the Body, where we're going to continue the conversation with mythologist, archetypal symbolist, philosopher, and musician Matthew Spencer Seeley. And I'll lead you back into the conversation about the body and everything we were discussing with this quote from Jung's notes of the seminar given in 1934 and 1939 on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. The body is a terribly awkward thing, and so it's omitted. We can deal with things spiritually so much more easily without the despicable body.
Now the gods are talking through the body because we give reality to the body. The body is what's real now instead of the spirit. We're materialists. We believe when the body is telling us something.
We've lost the inner contact with the spirit. We can't hear the spirit anymore. Or we can feel it, rather. And then, that was the other thing that was so key to me, for me and all of my yogic cohort training classmates, is how we really moved out of different states of dissociation. And again, physical dissociation is, now we know through trauma-informed psychology, is a defense, especially if you've been through a very violent traumatic situation. Dissociation is a defense. So if your body is in severe injury or pain or in a situation from which you cannot escape, dissociation, quote unquote, ranging from feeling less, getting a bit numb, to completely leaving your body, which gets, why there's a lot of trends towards shamanic healing now, because I think trauma is coming up is something we are so much more aware of as a culture, which I think is very, very beautiful, which brings me back to that lovely C word, which was a unique discovery to me in my, I hate using this phrase, but there's no other way, yogic journey. There, I said it. Is that, I noticed for myself and for my classmates, we were having this, oh, wow, we're allowed to be vulnerable, to be compassionate, both for ourselves and for each other. And, again, talking about illnesses, symptoms of it, not all illnesses, like traumatic ones, have, a physical, flesh wound situation. It's unseen. And that I felt that we as a cohort, and once again, something we still haven't touched on is the sacred space, I call this yoga nuns, is how we had left the quote unquote mundane world and we were allowed to be in, as we use I hate this phrase also, safe space. We were in safe space to explore sacred practice, to get in touch with dissociated parts of ourselves, to have, specifically my big boom awakening at the beginning of training was a somatic traumatic memory that came out. Something I hadn't forgotten, but which I had not processed the trauma of bodily. I'm very interested in explaining and understanding both that sacred space, that womb-like space. We were training in this literal place called an Om Dome. We were away from the world. We had withdrawn. And what happens in that space is coming back to the body, coming out of dissociation, awareness of trauma coming back into the body, quiet listening. Were we attuning? To me, I was attuning back to the voice of the divine, but how do all those elements come out in myth? What was going on there?
Definitely with the image of the womb and the sacred space, you've always had that in myths, the retreat into the cave before these mystical experiences happen. Something getting you away from the society in this kind of hermetically sealed world where you can. It's the same with the therapeutic world. It's like you step into the room and here you can open up and experience whatever you need to experience, and you're being supported. There's someone there holding that space for you. And then when you walk out the door, you're back in the world and you take that wisdom with you, but you don't have that same kind of freedom to fully be open to every element of yourself, because you can break down crying at work.
Right.
And what happens then? It's like Aldous Huxley saying, like, oh, this mescaline is great, but I certainly wouldn't want to do it when I'm driving, because then we'd all get into accidents.
So it's like you go from the moon goddess world back into the hunter world kind of difference. Is that like a
That's
fair
what's
comparison?
happening now. But I think it's also like you have to bring some of that feminine back into this hunting world that's not necessarily supposed to be a hunting world. And we are kind of looking for this return back to Mother Earth. I think the last 50 years, it's been like pretty obvious that we're looking to come back to this, that we're ashamed of over masculinizing what we've done to the world. And I think that you need to go into those spaces of femininity, which again, it's not just the women. I've seen so many men go for yoga to these shamans who heal with the body and shaking the body, and these men who haven't been touched like that before, that aren't allowed to be touched like that by other men, and it not be a sexual experience. You're just being touched and you're feeling, and they don't have a place where they're allowed to do that safely.
So there's compassion going on, there's healing going on, which women were allowed to do that for each other.
Right.
But for us, we had to step into this fully, and my cohort was fully female. So, all the teachers were female, all the training, yoga teachers in training, we were all female. And like I said, I used to call us all yoga nuns at this beautiful retreat where we trained for a month in 2017 in Spain, which was, interestingly, one of the managers of the place, who was Dutch, like my teacher, he pointed out that, we were in the grounds of a ruined olive oil press, but across the valley that we were in, we could see the ruins of an old church and an old monastery. And he made the point that, the Catholic Church really, energetically, purposefully picked where they would place a lot of churches. He's like, so this place has presence and meaning of this location. And so we were all in this world withdrawn space, but it was healing. So I think what you're describing is a feminine experience for men, but it's even more different when it's all, Vestal yoga virgins together in the middle of that time. And it was very, very womb-like. And I'm just, we're these disaffected, quote unquote, daughters of Christianity in that scenario. And I'm perpetually interested why we had to go to a quote unquote foreign spiritual practice to get back in touch with that. What is it in those teachings we're learning?
Or what's lacking in ours? I think it's like, do we have an equivalence of an embodied wisdom tradition in the West?
No, especially not for most of these women were from hardcore Protestant countries, Germany, Holland. A lot of them were from Holland, particularly, what is the nature of Calvinist Christianity towards the body? I'm descended from Scottish Presbyterians, woe betide you, like God is a hardwood bench and a wood cross and working hard. The body in hardcore Protestantism is not a place for pleasure. It's an instrument of work. Hard work, nonstop work makes you good. And I think rest and pleasure, well, in antiquity, like we would always say, oh, that's something for the papists. I don't know how Catholics are more allowed pleasure in the body. I think it's maybe the nature of confession and like, oh, he went off and quote unquote sinned, which might have been experiencing pleasure in the body, a little bit of gluttony with some good food and wine, adultery or something like that. Or, back in times when we cared, or at least majority cared about premarital sex, like that was pleasure because the idea of sex outside of wedlock was for pleasure. And, this is another aspect which I love about Eastern philosophy is that, pleasure is part of the route to God. To me, that's why so many people are studying Tantra now, because the real Calvinist thing is that anything but pain, suffering, hard work in the body, any pleasure is bad. And there is pleasure in yoga, like as opposed to sitting in a chair at a work desk all day. You're allowed to stretch. And like in that deep, deep stretch, a lot of the yogic poses are named after gods. And you're in this deep stretch as part of your divine devotion, as opposed to, I think I would love to bring an old Presbyterian Calvinist minister into like a modern yoga room, and he'd be like, lasciviousness, sin, you were all like doing horrible things, and you should be working in the fields and put your cap back on or something.
This talk of sexual repression, it makes me think of when Freud was studying for lack of a better term, this was the phrase of the time, the hysterical women. Mm-hmm. And they were coming in with their arms locked stiff. Mm-hmm. And that was a symptom of the sexual repression. And we don't have that anymore. We don't have that sexual repression in the same way that they had 100 years ago. And we don't have the manifestation of the symptoms in the same way. And it's like what Kira said, what's the thing now that you're not allowed to talk about? Like how 100 years it was all the sexual things you weren't allowed to talk about. What is it today that we're not allowed to talk about? And we thought this was funny when he said it, but I find it more and more true when I leave our little circles. It's God and religion and faith is what you cannot talk about in most circles these days. We exist in a very special kind of circle where it's like all we talk about with our friends, but you go out and you try to talk about these things to normal people and they're not so receptive to it. They're repressing it. Mm-hmm. This is a question I don't have the answer to, but what's the equivalence of that locked arm for the sexual repression that we're seeing now? What's the embodied symptom of a spiritual repression?
I mean, I think it's trauma and dissociation because, the title, I don't know if you remember this, the title of my thesis was Hysterical Yogis. Yeah. And I also specifically identified something that, so Freud's teacher, Charcot, who's actually a neurologist, a French neurologist who was famous because there's actual photographic documentation of hysterical women he took care of, was the way that they would launch themselves off the bed in what was called a C curve. So it'd be sort of like arms reaching out, feet reaching out, and doing like a C curve forward, and then like a deep, deep back bend. And back also to your point about the animal shaking off trauma. When you according to polyvagal theory, the more that you move your spine in movement to breath, for example, as we do in yoga, downward facing dog, exhale, inhale 3 times, then inhale into, an upward facing dog. To me, I just saw that in that motion. And then later when I saw these photographs of Charcot's hysterics, I was like, okay, what if those hysterics were doing like what my teacher Esther Eckhart created, the shakeout, to shake out that trauma, to shake out the spine, connect to the vagus nerve through sound, do a little like yelling while you're doing it. They're shaking out the trauma. The hysterics are doing it. And that's what I started to wonder if there was a, physical, neurological, nervous system connection to why we women, who a lot of us were traumatized, and a lot like me were having somatic traumatic memories come up in yoga teacher training. Something that was buried in the body was coming up to awareness. So again, hysterics. Now hysteria is what? You and I sat there studying psychopathology at Columbia in the DSM, and we can reel off all of these different diagnoses. So Freud worked on dementia praecox, which was then later turned into the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Some early hysterics were schizophrenics, but a lot just had really major anxiety. So back to your question now, what is the frozen somatic symptom? I think it's a whole bunch of things. I think it is anxiety with trauma at its roots. I think it's addiction with stress, anxiety, trauma at its roots. Addiction is off the charts. People in this country, in the United States, are dying massively from various different addictions that we don't know how to heal.
And that's a symptom, right? The addiction is the symptom.
Yeah. So we're talking about what's the frozen limb? What's the frozen limb? I think it's, and anxiety is being treated pharmaceutically, but there is, pharmaceuticals can only last so long, like, as I call them, the PAMs, diazepam and all of those, they only last so long. Like, And interestingly, there's this wonderful neurologist who was an addict herself. The book is called Never Enough, and I hope her name will come back to me, but look it up, Never Enough. And so she's a neurologist after she was an addict, and she breaks down every single drug. And once you detox from the PAMs, the anxiety drugs, what actually happens is your anxiety skyrockets for many, many months as you hopefully can maybe move back to neurological stasis, and you experience states of great, great anxiety. And guess who's going to be your only option then? They're going to send you back over to yoga camp with us for some breath work and some movement, because if you can't take the pills anymore, you're going to have to learn to regulate that symptom in another way. And that's just, the actual practical part of breath work and yoga to me is calming those down. The other taboo that I love, because we had sort of gone off of sex and talking about sex, is what I see all the time as a sexologist is we're not allowed to talk about impotence, either, anorgasmia in women or impotence in men. And we have the non-sacred sex. There is so much porn. And to be in porn in your own bedroom or on the screen, you're taking pills, you have fluffers, that is not the reality of the sexual energetic cycle. And, it's like being the superstar in The Office, the porn film. There is no room for a nap. There is no room for burnout in that. And then the polar opposite, you have Tantra, where the bodies together are just a vehicle for finding that sacredness. So, yeah, the symptom is anxiety, addiction, insomnia, impotence.
I did have the thought in the context of sexuality and femininity that we kind of are becoming more we're accepting more sexuality and sex and intercourse, but it's in a very masculine way, like the porn that seems to be popular now, or the
not for us woo folk.
Yeah. It seems like the way that we're embracing sexuality even is coming from this masculine lens. And it's not the tantric, receptive kind of sex.
Right. What does that feel like for you? Is like a guy in the modern world, what is that like for you?
There's a lot of things, I guess, that most guys say are things that most guys are into that some guys just aren't.
Okay. I'm so just curious about, what that experience is like. And as you said, you're more in the spiritual circles and sides, so you're probably not encountering it as much. I did in my own friend circle, a very, very highly spiritual friend of mine, really struggles with issues with pornography, and we speak about it because he's a very, very high spiritual being. He refers to it as an addiction. And yeah, I'm just kind of curious what you, in the context of, let's take that a little bit more symbolically and psychologically. It's not like this guy doesn't have a spiritual side at all. But to me, there is something in the image of, we'll just call it the archetype of the porn star, shall we?
Sure.
What is that the modern male could be finding? That he's to me, I'm thinking of the person who can work without burnout, right?
Right.
Because the porn star is the person who can just...
That's what you're saying. There's no room for impotence.
Nope. Not on camera, not
Which
in that
means
scene.
You are potent. You are powerful.
Mm-hmm.
With your magic wand.
Yeah.
That's always been, the phallus has always been ultimate source of magic.
Right. Whereas that just makes me laugh because, one of the very first, just, when we're talking about actual mechanical sex, which I'm always trying to remind clients who come to me, just guilt-ridden about their impotence, and this is both men and women, is that they're trying to achieve orgasm through, again, this is a heteronormative example because that's the majority of my clients and my personal experience, is penetrative sex, and that the idea that penetrative sex is the way to bring about an orgasm in someone who is possessing of a vagina. And it's no, actually, the average timing of an erection does not align with the timing needs of a vagina, a vulva, because we've got to include most of it's all clitoral. So the reality is, if you want to deliver a good orgasm, you really are going to have a talented set of hands or tongue and various like skills with toys, essentially. As the great Dan Savage always likes to say, the hammer didn't build the house. You used the hammer to build the house, so let's like remember to include toys here, but that toys are the number one threat to the super, super masculine male. Like, as you're saying, it's the magic wand. It's the cock that doesn't experience impotence. It's like, well, we couldn't use a toy then. It's very interesting because, there are so many cultures that worship the phallus, the voodoo culture, the Shiva lingam. And how have
Which is a penis-vagina combination.
It is, but as sacred symbol and then modality back to God. But then how have we gotten lost in the porn star, the magic baguette? Baguette is the French word for like wand, as well as bread. So what I'm saying is like, I see the male just not understanding why he's like enwrapped and held in this enthrallment of porn. And, the great eternal unending erection of the porn star it's the oppression under the solar god. That's basically the way I'm seeing it. I'm literally seeing it like the masculine suffering under the masculine.
Do you see porn as being something for men?
I mean, I'm specifically thinking of this one friend and coachee.
Because I know a lot of women who are also unhealthily addicted or obsessed with porn.
Oh my God,
and particularly these, images of the perfect phallus and even the violent elements.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that, there's some in the woman of like that, the allure of danger, where it's like the 5 kinds of men that women are attracted to. It's vampires, pirates, and then you've got doctors. Gosh, I'm forgetting the others. But they're like monsters, basically. Mm-hmm. Werewolves. Mm-hmm. This is what women find very attractive.
It is. But what in all of our fantasy romance stories happens with those monsters? Let's take Twilight.
I didn't read Twilight.
Okay, well, what Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman, Dracula, what happens to the monster?
What happens?
He's in love with her. He's been in love with her for centuries. As Gary Oldman's Dracula seduces Winona Ryder's Mina, he says, I have been looking for you for centuries. It's the demon that's always been in love with the pure white feminine. So it's not merely she wants the monster. The werewolf, he'll kill everyone, but he won't kill the girl he loves. That's when he destroys himself, because he doesn't want to destroy her. So it's always that the beauty of her feminine desire to receive transforms the monster. That's always the missing element. Now, the part that toxic masculinity doesn't get about that is they're just like all focused on like the ravishment. But to me, that's within, he is something from the other world. The vampire, even though he's been, depending on how you look at that myth, he's been transformed by the sacred, even if it's the dark sacred. The werewolf is participating in the animal world. She doesn't want the guy who's going to like be the super porn star and then leave. It is the monster who stays and is transformed and then, follows her, shadows her, protects her, even though he himself is a danger.
And how do you reconcile that? A woman's desire for this man to be a danger to everyone but her. Now, if everyone's man is this kind of monster who's not going to hurt the one woman that they love, but they're going to be a monster to everyone else, how does that work for society?
Right, but let's once again take the Jungian tact of like, every person in the story is one person. It's all parts of your psyche, right?
Yes, but then there is also, we extract that to the manifest fact that women do actually seek out this dangerous element that is going to protect them. That's like a real thing that happens.
Right, but that's the inner psyche saying that we want to be protected from our own inner monstrosity. And we keep destroying ourselves in monstrous ways and in violent ways. But what we really want is for that sacred, vulnerable feminine side to be protected by that monstrous side as opposed to destroyed by it. And those are two different visions in the culture. You know, I mean, when I moved and studied in France, I loved the idea that they had no problem with like a sex scene where a couple's making love, but they have a huge problem with showing children violence. And that's two different versions of engaging with bodies. You know, a child in America has shown a destruction of a body much more easily than sexuality, using the body for modes of like consensual pleasure between two people. That's a really, really big dichotomy. And I'm also going to take a difference to like women craving that danger as opposed to maybe we want something very otherworldly and powerful to both awaken us sexually and to protect us. But also there's that fear element there. But in reality, you know, there's this comedian who says like, statistically, women are in the most danger from men. So the craziest thing a woman could do is to date a man. So sacredness of the body is very, very far out there in concept from reality in our lives as human beings.
I'm reminded of this. I think this was like the only difference that I learned between working with men and women when I was doing a form of shamanic Reiki. When you're working with the lower chakras, you don't want to like touch them on, you know, clients that you're not terribly familiar with because they're near some delicate regions. So when you're working with the sex chakra, you put a hand on the hip as an indicator that you're there. But when you're working with women, a lot of trauma is stored in the hip and is stored in the sex chakra because a lot of it is sexual trauma. So you need to be even careful about touching women's hips, and that's like a really powerful trauma releasing mechanism. I was taught this practice where you synchronize the heart, the client's heart, with the frequency of the earth, and then you can synchronize the sex chakra with the heart using that earth frequency, and it'll clear out those sexual traumas.
How do you do that?
Reiki.
Oh, okay. Fascinated. I love it. No, I mean, that resonates with something that one of my root teachers said, which, you know, I think at this point all yoga teachers are trained in this one, that any position like reclining butterfly, which is feet together, knees apart, hips wide open, you know, is a very vulnerable position, which is, again, very interesting. You do that normally at the end of the practice when the body would be wound down through the whole arc of the asana practice. The body would be wound down into a state of parasympathetic nervous state and nice, calm, rest, digest, feeling safe. And that's when you would do that pose. But most yoga teachers, as I was saying, are probably today trained that that is a position where somatic repressed trauma could come out of the body. And I think it's very, very key, this trauma held in the body. And, you know, I think there's a question still kind of unanswered there because we brought in the archetype of the inner monster, but the monster as lover. And I think there's something there that we didn't quite untangle or name, but it's an interesting thing how that came into awareness in the space at the same time, because the vampire, the werewolf, goes from predator to transformed lover, which is also interesting. The same thing in 50 Shades of Grey. Many in the BDSM community would take offense at this, that, you know, his kink comes out of trauma. But the idea is that, you know, it's similar to like the vampire loving this pure being, the werewolf loving her and not harming her when he transforms into the monster, is that Christian Grey changes and is healed through his relationship with, once again, this ridiculously pure submissive, who, well, she turns into a sub. Don't know if she ever really was. Maybe she got transformed into a sub the same way the vampire sometimes transforms the human into a vampire. More on that for deep thought later. But yeah, I'm interested in the comparison between monster and trauma.
Because the monster is something that's unwanted, repressed, hidden, relegated to the shadows, that's now coming out of the shadows and needs to be addressed. A trauma is something that, if it's, you know, it's still there because it hasn't been fully
Integrated?
Yeah, integrated. I use the word grokked from Stranger in a Strange Land. This Martian, every time he encounters a novel situation on Earth, he goes into this like meditative stasis until he's integrated all of the information, and then he can come out and talk to you again. And anytime he experiences something very new that's shocking to him, he'll just freeze up, and everyone around goes, "Oh, what's wrong with him?" He's like catatonic, but he is integrating all of this information on all of his levels of being. And once that's integrated, he'll come back out and start talking to you again. So I always use that term grok to mean like fully integrate the information as much as your body can take, where you're not holding on to anything hidden anymore.
That's interesting, because that's so much what, now you've like answered the question. Like that's what was happening in that yoga teacher training as we all got more deeply into our bodies out of dissociation. We were taking in information on multiple different levels. A lot of it, as you point out, like archetypal, that we, I call it the wordless wisdom, the wordless information that was being communicated into the bodies via sensation and via, bodily practices. Again, if you use the idea that yoga, moving on the breath, moving the spine on the breath, if that brings down the parasympathetic nervous system, we're calming the system every day. We're doing it in a safe space. We're allowing dissociation to go away. In fact, we're training ourselves to come into sensation, which is the opposite. And we're calming the body, which is allowing traumas to filter out. And it's new information that's being integrated on a fully body integral level. And to go back to the monsters, they're all embodied, right? The werewolf contains, like, it's the idea that he's been bitten by something. It's sort of based off of rabies, right? So it came from the idea that people who got hydrophobia, right? It happens. You're actually scared of water when you have rabies, but you're foaming at the mouth, and you're actually, I think you die of dehydration. It's one of the things you die of if you die of it. And then, the vampire has had his blood changed. And so there's this inner devouring aspect of the monster, of the vampire. And then, Christian Grey was consumed by his sadistic fetish, which, I focused a lot in my studies about how there was a lot of work done to move sadism out of the pathological category in the DSM-5. And, I don't think Christian Grey would fit into that, because it really does control and disturb and rule his life. Like, he was living his life to work around it, in the same way someone with a porn addiction, that could disturb their life. So we're kind of going from like monster to trauma to healing to integrating. And, as we know, that like the Freudian model was to bring the trauma to awareness. If you could remember the classic idea of the carriage accident that traumatized you, that made you terrified of horses or something like that. If you could bring that into awareness, you could then take it out of the subconscious and integrate it consciously. So that's what I think was going on in the practice of yoga. It was the psychoanalytical experience through bringing the body out of dissociation, bringing consciousness back into the body via sensation and movement, and practices which calm the nervous system from sympathetic to parasympathetic. And only then, in the calmed state, are you then ready to receive something divine. And I think maybe there is something divine in integration and the healing that occurs there. Because it's, like you were saying about the yin and the yang versus the othering of good and bad, integrating and healing trauma are coming back to a form of wholeness with something that, you might be pushing aside. Like, you really want to other that. You don't want to go back and remember that trauma. And not that that's the only way to go and heal trauma. But that, like you were saying, you're talking about doing the practice of Reiki. That's very, very different healing in the body, as opposed to what might be re-traumatizing to go into a therapeutic room and talk about a trauma. Because you have to bring it up and analyze it consciously and talk about it. Versus you could just lie on a table and receive a Reiki healing. And energetically, you're releasing it, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's very, very interesting. Like, take Jung and Freud over here. We're going to talk about it. Bring it up verbally into consciousness with words and analysis. And then the somatic felt healing.
Is the feeling enough to heal? Because I think the Jungian thing is like, feel it. And then let's figure out what that feeling is, where it comes from, and why it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get all of that from just the feeling? Or do you need to do some mental analysis, whether it's talking or something mental that's happening?
I mean, to me, that's having both is the balance of the masculine, the feminine, the healing domain. If we're going to be calling talk therapy and analyzing something verbally with a trained mental health care professional, as well in tandem working with the Reiki person, the acupuncturist, the somatic therapist, the sound healer, the yoga trauma teacher, I could go through naming modalities for the next half hour. That's what I like about the cultural zeitgeist going on right now, is that balance. So to me, in the modality, you're talking about what is the symptom now. And I think it's trauma, anxiety, addiction. And I like very much this double partnership, which I find the balance of masculine and feminine, of healing via the body, the energy systems, without words, and then healing via the logos. To me, that's the dichotomy I wrote a lot about in my thesis of eros and logos.
I do think that is a nice balance to have. I did answer my own question as you were talking about that, though, which is just as the talk therapy alone, I do think can heal physiological symptoms. I think that body work alone can heal mental symptoms. I think that's very clear, that working on the body helps the psyche, right? It's not just releasing things, it's actually doing the healing work that talk therapy would do.
Got it. So that in the end is the wisdom of the body. That's the gnosis of the body then. So we figured that all out for you people. You're welcome.
You're welcome.